Now, the Amnesty report goes on to call for the Palestinian government to end the campaign of intimidation and violence directed at Palestinians, agree to an independent investigation of its human rights violations. So I want to know if you will publicly, on your website, unconditionally, join Amnesty in calling for that investigation.
That goes without saying. I absolutely hear and publicly condemn every atrocity that Hamas has ever committed. Now, it's a question of consistency. Are you ready as well to join me in condemning all of Israel's atrocities that are laid out in detail in every human rights report that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch puts together?
I'm absolutely, if you're asking me that question, I'm absolutely for an independent investigation of alleged human rights violations.
No. It's not an independent
on both
investigations
sides.
have already taken place.
No.
And they have found that Israel is guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
If there is an independent violation, and it can be done with Amnesty participation, it can be done with Ken Roth's participation, and it's done with, say, the EU and folks who have displayed a certain balance, I'd be absolutely for it. Look, I'll give you an example of my concern. As I understand it, Amnesty, which does many good things. Amnesty called for, a question about Amnesty, called for an end of the use, end of supplying Israel with certain arms because of the human rights violations. I'm not aware of Amnesty having called for Saudi Arabia or other countries to cease arming the folks who were rocketing Israeli civilians for the 8 years.
So I want to be clear. We have called recently for an end, let's use the word arms embargo. I don't know if that's the actual phrase, to both sides, given that we condemn both sides for deliberate attacks on civilians.
And for the 8 years between 2000 and
2000? We've condemned the firing. We've condemned anyone supplying those kinds of arms to be used against civilians.
I'm perfectly happy to have human rights investigators from governments with the participation of human rights organizations, absolutely, on both sides, given free access on the Gaza side and on the Israeli side.
So let's take questions from the floor, if we could. We only have a few minutes left. Again, I apologize for the limited time we have.
We might be hoping to extend it a little bit, so we're going to try to...
Okay, yeah, I'll wait for a signal from you.
I've
okay?
hardly said anything over the past 10 minutes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Would it be possible for me to just respond to some of the things that were said?
Quickly, yes. Okay.
Very briefly.
Sir.
On the issue of settlements and the two-state solution, of course, we never got a straight answer on Israel's continued settlement expansion in contravention to international law. We didn't know why Israel is continuing with that settlement expansion. It's important to note is that always there has been significant omissions in the history of the conflict. We were told that the Palestinians rejected the partition back in 1947, but the Israelis accepted it. This is only half true. In fact, anybody who's looking at any of the documentation that came out from Ben Gurion's internal documents, for his biography and so on, it was very clear that he saw this as a temporary state until he was able to muster enough power to take over the remaining territories. So it's disputable whether you can really say that Israel accepted the partition. But of course, before the occupation, there were many reasons why conflict had existed. We can talk about the driving out of 700,000 Palestinians from their homes. You can talk about the invasion of Egypt in 1956, and there are many reasons that we can both cite about why conflict existed. But the fact remains is that since 1988, the entire world has agreed on what the solution is, and the only country that is outstanding that has kept the solution from happening is actually Israel. We were told that Israel had made a generous offer in 2000 that the Palestinians rejected and then launched violence. Of course, as I noted a second ago, Israel was expanding and solidifying its occupation of the West Bank, and it accelerated that settlement expansion in the year that it was supposed to be making that proposal. And the person who was Israel's foreign minister at the time, Shlomo Ben Ami, had actually said that had he been Palestinian, he would not have accepted the Camp David Accords. So that should tell you something about how fair those terms were. And the last thing I want to point out about that is that it was not the Palestinians that walked away and then just launched the violence. There was an incident that triggered the Second Intifada, and that was triggered by Ariel Sharon, who marched into the Muslim part of Temple Mount surrounded by soldiers, and then when they confronted demonstrators, they opened up live ammunition on unarmed demonstrators, killing 7 of them, and this is when the violence was launched. So those omissions of settlement expansion, of the unfairness of the deal, of who triggered the violence, are things that are absolutely essential to understanding why violence takes place. And the last thing I want to emphasize is that the entire world every year votes on the question of Palestine in the UN General Assembly. Every single year, the whole world is on one end, and on the other side is the United States, Israel, and a couple of countries in the Pacific Ocean who vote against. This is public opinion of the world, of how the solution should be, how the conflict should be settled, and I think it's about time that we actually push Israel to join the world consensus in abiding by international law.
I'm looking for some hands. Yes, sir.
Getting back to Gaza, it's clear that many innocent Gazans were killed. No question about that. The question, though, is why, and particularly to what extent this was the result of deliberate action on one side or the other that led to it. We have the claim on the one hand that Hamas is deliberately using civilians as human shields. We have the claim on the other side that Israeli forces are deliberately targeting, not just hitting, but targeting civilians, innocent civilians. These both are claims of deliberate action for the same result. And I want to know what evidence either of you have of the deliberate nature of the results that are very clear.
Well, I'm going to answer first, and I'll be brief. First, the term human shields actually has a very well-defined meaning, which is when, let's say, a military force deliberately and intentionally takes a civilian and places that civilian in harm's way with the intention of deterring some kind of response from the other side. And it's become a term that is very loosely used. Because if Jeff will permit me, what I think he was saying, and certainly we've heard it from many on the Israeli side, is that when the Palestinians, so the claim goes, place armaments near a civilian infrastructure, civilian structures, civilians in general, that's human shields. That's something else. I'm not justifying it, but that's something else. That's in a sense making a military target out of a nearby civilian area, because in fact, if you do fire, then that does, for the time that that armament is there, that does become a legitimate military target for the other side. Part of what Amnesty is claiming, based on our research, and we were in Gaza very quickly after the conflict, is that first, with regard to the white phosphorus, first the Israelis denied using it. And then they said, well, yes, we did use it, but it was legitimate use. This we dispute. There is a legitimate use for white phosphorus when it is used in between the two opposing forces in order to obscure troop movements. It is banned from use on military forces and on civilians, pure and simple, banned. And we believe the Israelis used it in heavily populated civilian areas of Gaza. And we regard that as illegitimate. And Human Rights Watch reached the same conclusion in a report that came out after ours. We also found the use of flechettes in civilian areas, which are these kinds of bomblets that are sharp-pointed objects. And we found them in the walls of the neighborhoods. Keep in mind, Gaza is a very heavily populated area. And so for the Israelis to claim that we drop leaflets, they drop leaflets urging people to leave a particular neighborhood or part of a city to go elsewhere. There's nowhere to go. So we do regard that as disingenuous. That, in a nutshell, is what we mean by disproportionate and deliberate. Now, I'll give each of our friends a chance to respond, but I will urge them to be concise.
I will be as concise as I can, consistent with the fact that my good friend Josh speaks for me, but not accurately. First of all, he's quite incorrect about the definition of human shields, with all due respect.
Okay.
It's not simply a matter of taking one person and kidnapping him. It is, and it's not placing weaponry near a facility. That's simply nonsense, with all due respect. It is actually firing from within mosques, from within schools, from within community centers. And it is as well storing the stuff in there. And it is in fact hiding in there, knowing that basically the Israelis have absolutely no option. They can simply, to put it pretty bluntly, sit there and have the rockets rain